I am Meredith, 33 years old, and on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, my groom decided to marry his mistress instead. I did not scream or throw a tantrum when he handed me a payoff check and told me to leave through the service exit. I simply dropped my engagement ring into his champagne glass and walked away. By the time he realized the woman he discarded was actually the sole heiress to a private equity empire, he was on his knees begging for mercy. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had the satisfaction of watching arrogant people orchestrate their own downfall. Growing up, my father William taught me that true power never needs to shout. As the founder of a Manhattan private equity firm, he raised me to understand wealth. I chose to hide my identity working as a consultant to prove my merit without my family name. I wanted a life based on genuine connection. That is how I met Brandon. He was a Wall Street hedge fund manager, sharp and ambitious, or so I thought. We fell in love, got engaged, and planned an elegant wedding at the Oak Haven estate. I believed he loved me for who I was, a hardworking woman who bought clothes on sale and budgeted carefully. My illusions shattered on the afternoon of our wedding. I was standing in the bridal suite, fully dressed in my white gown, adjusting my veil in the mirror. The heavy oak door to the adjoining sitting room was cracked open an inch. Through that narrow gap, I heard Brandon speaking. His tone was not nervous or excited, it was calculating and cold. Then I heard a woman laugh. It was Brittany. She was the daughter of a mid-level real estate investor, a woman who thrived on high society galas and flaunting designer labels. I knew her only as an acquaintance of Brandon. Brandon told her that her father had just wired $5 million to his firm's offshore account. He said the cash was the only thing keeping his fund from going under. Then he said the words that made my blood run cold. He promised Brittany that because her family saved him, he was making her the bride today. He told her the guests would barely notice the switch, and anyone who did would understand he needed a partner in his own tax bracket. I stood perfectly still. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the tears I expected never came. Instead, an absolute chilling clarity washed over me. The man I had spent 3 years loving was nothing but a desperate fraud drowning in bad debt. Before I could even process my next move, the door pushed open. Brandon walked in holding 2 glasses of champagne. He stopped when he saw me staring directly at him. He did not look guilty. He did not even flinch. He walked over to the vanity, set the glasses down, and pulled a folded piece of paper from his tuxedo jacket. He held it out to me with a look of supreme boredom. He explained there was a change of plans. He told me his firm needed capital, and Brittany brought a $5 million dowry to the table. He actually had the audacity to say it was strictly business, and that I should understand. He handed me the paper, revealing it was a cashier check for $10,000. He told me to take the money, pack my cheap clothes, and leave quietly through the back exit, so I would not cause a scene. I looked at the check, then up at his perfectly styled hair and arrogant smirk. He honestly believed he held all the power. He thought I was just a financially unstable consultant who would jump at a $10,000 handout. I did not raise my voice. I took the check from his hand and slowly, deliberately tore it directly down the middle. Then I tore it again, letting the pieces fall onto the expensive Persian rug. I slid the 2-carat diamond ring off my finger. I picked up his champagne glass, dropped the ring into the bubbling liquid, and set it back on the table. I told him I hoped the $5 million would be enough to cover the massive hole in his fraudulent ledgers. I turned around, gathered the train of my dress, and walked out the door with my head held high, leaving him staring after me. I navigated the back corridors of the estate, shedding the heavy tulle skirt, and stepping into my car, parked near the catering vans. I felt a strange sense of liberation taking the wheel. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed on the dashboard. It was a text message from Brandon. He wrote that since I wanted to be dramatic and refuse his generous payoff, I needed to pack my cheap stuff and get out of our luxury Manhattan apartment by tonight. He added the lease was in his name and locks would be changed at midnight. I sat in the driver's seat reading the message twice. A genuine laugh escaped my lips. Brandon loved boasting about that exclusive building. He loved pretending he owned the world. He had no idea I did not just live there. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a thick leather portfolio containing the master deed to the entire residential high-rise building. I had purchased the property 3 years ago through one of my blind trusts. Brandon had been paying his exorbitant monthly rent directly into my corporate accounts this entire time. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my primary wealth manager. I smiled as the call connected, realizing Brandon had just declared war on the landlord he never knew he had. I watched from the tinted windows of my town car as building security physically escorted Diane and Megan onto the bustling Manhattan sidewalk. Diane was red in the face, waving her arms frantically and screaming at the guards. Even through the thick glass, I could read her lips. She was threatening to call every single one of my freelance consulting clients to ruin my pathetic career. A genuine smile spread across my face. My mother-in-law had no idea that my client list consisted entirely of billionaire investors and hedge fund titans who answered directly to me. I took a sip of bottled water, signaled my driver to pull away, and left them stranded on the curb with their garbage bags full of Brandon's cheap golf shirts. My peaceful ride back to my private estate did not last long. My phone began vibrating relentlessly against the leather seat. Notifications flooded my screen in rapid succession, draining the battery with every passing second. I opened a social media app and instantly saw Brandon's face. He had posted a highly produced, tear-jerking video that was already going viral across multiple platforms. In the video, he sat on a plush velvet sofa beside Sienna, both of them looking appropriately somber and victimized. Brandon looked directly into the camera lens and spun a masterful web of lies. He claimed I was a manipulative gold digger who had been secretly draining his bank accounts for years to fund a lavish lifestyle I could not afford. He told his hundreds of thousands of followers that he had discovered my deceit just hours before our wedding ceremony. According to his fabricated story, I had tried to ruin his big day by threatening to destroy his professional reputation unless he paid me a massive extortion fee. He even squeezed out a single pathetic tear as he framed Sienna as his true savior. He called her the woman who had stood by him, recognized his pain, and rescued him from my toxic grasp. He painted a picture of two star-crossed lovers forced to make a drastic choice to protect their future. The internet is a vicious place, and Brandon's followers swallowed his performance completely. The comments section was an absolute war zone of vitriol. Strangers were calling me every vile name imaginable, demanding my consulting business be boycotted, and praising Brandon for escaping a monster. They painted me as a desperate freelancer trying to extort a highly successful Wall Street manager. I simply locked my phone and tossed it onto the seat beside me. I did not feel the slightest need to defend myself to ignorant strangers online. Brandon was playing checkers for social media clout while I was moving chess pieces on a board he could not even comprehend. Just as I walked through the double doors of my home and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, my personal secure cell phone rang. It was a restricted line, a number only a handful of trusted associates possessed. I checked the caller ID and raised an eyebrow in surprise. It was Terrence. Terrence was Megan's husband, my African-American brother-in-law, and the only person in Brandon's entire toxic family who possessed a shred of integrity. He was a brilliant forensic accountant, fiercely principled, and he had always treated me with genuine respect. While the rest of the family sneered at my practical clothes and modest lifestyle, Terrence had always recognized my intelligence. I answered the call, fully expecting him to ask about the viral video or apologize for his wife's unhinged behavior at the apartment building. Instead, his voice was hushed, urgent, and laced with absolute certainty. He did not waste time on pleasantries or fake sympathy. He told me he was currently locked inside his home office, digging deep into Brandon's recent financial filings. He said he knew Brandon was lying in that ridiculous video because the raw numbers told a completely different, much darker story. I listened carefully, sipping my coffee as Terrence laid out his findings with surgical precision. He confirmed what I already knew to be true. Brandon's firm was bleeding cash at an alarming, unsustainable rate. He was drowning in toxic debt, and the $5 million capital injection from Sienna's father was nothing more than a temporary bandage on a fatal bullet wound. Terrence explained that Brandon had been desperately covering margin calls by shifting money from client trust accounts, essentially running a massive Ponzi scheme right under the noses of his wealthy investors. But that was not the main reason Terrence was calling me on a secure line. He took a sharp breath and lowered his voice even further, making sure his wife was not listening outside the door. He told me he had found a massive anomaly buried deep in the firm's offshore corporate ledgers. An enormous, untraceable shadow corporation had been aggressively and quietly buying up all of Brandon's outstanding debt over the last 48 hours. Every single loan, every margin call, every piece of leverage Brandon had in the world was now owned by a single terrifying entity. Terrence asked if I was near a secure computer. I walked over to my mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and told him to send the file immediately. A moment later, an encrypted document appeared in my private inbox. I entered the complex decryption key Terrence provided and opened the sprawling spreadsheet. I traced the intricate web of shell companies, dummy corporations, and proxy buyers Terrence had painstakingly mapped out. He had followed the money trail, brilliantly cutting through layers of corporate obfuscation until he reached the parent company at the very top of the food chain. The shadow corporation holding the financial leash around Brandon's neck was none other than Kensington Global. Terrence was silent on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a mixture of professional awe and profound confusion. He asked me why a multi-billion-dollar private equity empire would care about a small-time pathetic fraud like Brandon. He asked why Kensington Global, an absolute titan of the financial world, was systematically and intentionally trapping his brother-in-law. I leaned back in my leather chair looking at the spreadsheet illuminating my screen. Terrence had done incredible work. He had proven his loyalty and his intellect in one swift, decisive move. He was a good man, trapped in a family of absolute parasites, and he deserved the unvarnished truth. I took a slow breath and told him to ensure his office door was securely locked. I told him he was absolutely right about Brandon's fraud, and he was right about Kensington Global acquiring every cent of the debt. Then I asked Terrence a simple question. I asked if he knew who currently controlled the massive assets of Kensington Global. He recited the public information stating it was managed by an elite board of directors, acting on behalf of the elusive Kensington Family Trust. I smiled into the phone, letting the silence stretch for just a moment. I told Terrence that the trust was no longer elusive. I told him I orchestrated the $5 million investment from Sienna's father through a hidden proxy. I told him I was the one pulling the strings, buying the debt, and tightening the noose around Brandon's neck. Terrence did not speak for a long time. The silence stretched across the secure line as the immense gravity of my words settled in his brilliant mind. He finally whispered my full name, absolute realization dawning on him. I confirmed his suspicion without hesitation. I told him I was not just a freelance consultant who bought clothes on sale. I was Diana Kensington, the sole heiress and acting chief executive of the empire that now completely owned his brother-in-law. I told him Brandon had arrogantly made his bed, and I was going to ensure he slept in it for the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I smiled into the phone, the encrypted file glowing brightly on my laptop screen. I told Terrence that apex predators do not care about the ants they step on, but sometimes an ant crawls onto the wrong boot. I thanked him for his brilliant forensic work and promised him that his unwavering integrity would be rewarded very soon. I ended the call just as a new notification popped up on my screen. It was an urgent alert from the retail bank where Brandon and I held our joint checking accounts. Brandon had predictably thrown a massive temper tantrum over his toxic mother and sister being unceremoniously dumped on the Manhattan sidewalk by my security team. Thinking he still held the absolute financial leash, he had executed a pathetic and highly predictable power play. He called his bank to freeze our joint checking accounts and immediately canceled the platinum credit cards he had so generously provided for me during our engagement. He genuinely believed I was a struggling freelance consultant, relying entirely on his Wall Street scraps to survive in the city. He thought starving me of cash would force me to crawl back to him by nightfall, begging for rent money, and tearfully apologizing for evicting his precious family. It was a classic abuser tactic, isolating the victim financially to force total submission. I did not panic. I did not call him to argue or plead. I simply forwarded the bank notification to my personal wealth manager with a brief instruction to heavily monitor Brandon's personal accounts for any signs of absolute insolvency. If he wanted to play financial games, he was about to learn he was playing against the house. Later that evening, I decided to treat myself to a quiet, elegant dinner. I made a reservation at Laura, a notoriously exclusive Michelin star restaurant in the heart of the financial district, where securing a table usually required a 6-month wait or a very powerful last name. I wore a tailored emerald green silk dress, perfectly understated, but undeniably expensive. The maitre d' greeted me by name the moment I walked through the gold-plated doors and immediately escorted me to a secluded prime table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the glittering skyline. I was enjoying my appetizer, a delicate sea bass carpaccio paired with a crisp white wine, when a loud, grating voice shattered the refined ambiance of the dining room. I did not even need to turn my head. Brandon was standing near the host stand, his arm wrapped possessively around Brittany's waist. He was wearing a flashy velvet dinner jacket, loudly demanding a window table from the increasingly irritated host staff. Then his eyes locked onto me, sitting peacefully in the VIP section. A nasty, triumphant sneer spread across his face. He left Brittany standing at the front and marched directly over to my table, dragging a thoroughly mortified young waiter along with him. He slapped his hand flat on my table, causing my crystal water glass to rattle. He loudly announced to the waiter and the surrounding tables that they needed to secure a form of payment from me immediately. He practically shouted that he had personally frozen all my bank accounts that afternoon and canceled my credit cards. He told the waiter and everyone within earshot that I was a broke, desperate freelancer trying to scam a free luxury meal, and that my cards would instantly decline the moment they were swiped. The dining room fell uncomfortably silent. Other wealthy patrons paused their meals, watching the spectacle with wide eyes and hushed whispers. The waiter looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight and stammering a quiet apology to me. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Brandon's gloating face. I calmly reached into my designer clutch and withdrew a heavy, solid metal black card. I handed the American Express Centurion card to the waiter without a single word. Brandon burst into obnoxious laughter. He pointed at the card and loudly claimed it was a fake piece of plastic I had bought online just to look rich. He told the waiter to cut it up right there. His cruel laughter was cut abruptly short when the restaurant's general manager rushed over to our table. The manager completely ignored Brandon, stepping right past him to bow deeply to me. He held my metal card on a small silver tray and handed it back with profound reverence. He announced clearly, ensuring Brandon heard every single syllable, that Madam's payment method was beyond reproach. He then snapped his fingers, and a sommelier appeared holding a dusty, unlabeled bottle. The manager offered me the complimentary bottle of a rare vintage Bordeaux reserved strictly for their absolute top-tier VIP guests, thanking me for gracing their establishment tonight. Brandon's face contorted in furious, red-faced confusion. His jaw practically unhinged as he watched the staff fawn over me. He spun around, grabbed Brittany's hand as she approached, and shoved his way back to the manager. He demanded to know why a pathetic gold digger was getting VIP treatment and free wine, while he, a highly successful hedge fund manager, was being forced to wait at the door. He puffed out his chest and loudly attempted to use Brittany's father's name to secure the best table in the house, claiming his new father-in-law practically owned the entire commercial block and could buy and sell the restaurant. The manager straightened his posture and looked at Brandon with icy, unwavering disdain. He coldly informed Brandon that there would be no table available for them tonight or any other night. The manager leaned in close and clearly stated that relying on Brittany's father was a massive mistake. He informed the arrogant groom that Brittany's father's massive corporate credit line had been completely slashed and heavily reduced that very morning by his primary lender. The color drained entirely from Brittany's heavily contoured face. She stared at the manager in absolute horror, her designer handbag slipping from her grasp and hitting the marble floor with a dull thud. Brandon stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing in silent shock as the reality of his rapidly collapsing world began to set in. Brandon practically shoved his way out of the restaurant doors, dragging a sobbing Brittany behind him as they fled the humiliation of the declined credit card. I watched them scramble into the freezing New York night, knowing their desperate attempt to escape reality would only lead them directly into my next trap. They desperately needed a grandiose validation of their fabricated high society status. According to their meticulously curated social media profiles, they were heading straight to the airport to board a first-class flight to Aspen. They were determined to salvage their disastrous wedding day by celebrating their honeymoon at the Summit Lodge, the most opulent five-star sanctuary in the Colorado mountains. I knew exactly where they were going, and I was entirely prepared for their arrival. The Summit Lodge belonged to a luxury hospitality group that my firm had been quietly negotiating to buy for the past 6 months. Following Brandon's little stunt at the altar, I decided to stop negotiating and simply throw cash at the deal to expedite the paperwork. By the time their flight touched down in the snow-covered mountains, the final signatures were dry and the funds had cleared. I legally owned the mountain they were standing on. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, opened my laptop in the comfort of my Manhattan penthouse, and pulled up the live security feed from the resort's grand lobby. The general manager was fully briefed, highly compensated, and eagerly waiting for his cue. Brandon and Brittany strutted through the massive sliding glass doors of the lodge like returning royalty. They were draped in obnoxious, oversized fur coats and pristine designer snow boots that had clearly never touched actual powder. Brandon immediately snapped his fingers at a passing bellhop, barking an arrogant order for the staff to carefully handle their matching sets of expensive luggage. He marched up to the concierge desk with that same unbearable smirk he wore when he tried to hand me the $10,000 payoff check. He slapped his driver license onto the polished oak counter and loudly demanded the keys to the presidential suite, projecting his voice to ensure the wealthy guests in the nearby lounge area could hear him brag about his booking. Through the high-definition audio of the security feed, I listened as the concierge typed gracefully at her keyboard. She paused, offered a polite practice smile, and typed again. She then looked up and informed Brandon in the sweetest customer service voice imaginable that his reservation had been permanently canceled. Brandon scoffed, leaning heavily against the counter. He told her she was clearly incompetent and aggressively demanded she refresh the screen. When she reiterated that the suite was no longer available to him and that they had no rooms to offer, his fake aristocratic facade instantly crumbled into pure, unfiltered entitlement. He slammed his fist against the wood. He began screaming at the poor woman, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the elegant lobby. He demanded to know if she had any idea who his father-in-law was. He threatened to have her fired, claiming Brittany's family practically funded the entire local real estate market and could buy the building. Brittany joined the fray, whining loudly that her dream honeymoon was being intentionally ruined by jealous minimum wage workers. They caused an absolute scene, throwing a spectacular tantrum that forced several wealthy patrons to cover their children's ears and turn away in sheer disgust. That was exactly when the general manager stepped out from his office. He was a tall, imposing man who did not tolerate a shred of disrespect toward his staff. He calmly approached the desk, picked up Brandon's identification, and slid it right back across the counter. He did not offer an apology or a complimentary drink. Instead, he looked Brandon dead in the eye and stated that there was absolutely no computer error. The manager formally announced that the entire resort, along with its 12 sister properties across the globe, had been acquired the previous day by a massive private equity firm. Brandon crossed his arms arrogantly, demanding to know what corporate ownership had to do with his honeymoon suite. The manager leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative register. He informed Brandon that the new owner had issued a direct, non-negotiable directive immediately after the sale closed. Brandon Pierce was officially and permanently blacklisted from all properties under the corporate umbrella. He was expressly forbidden from dining, lodging, or even standing in the lobby. The manager then gestured toward the heavy glass doors flanked by two broad-shouldered security guards who had quietly moved into position and ordered Brandon to vacate the premises immediately. Brittany shrieked, stamping her designer boot and demanding to speak to whoever was in charge of this supposed private equity firm. The manager offered a tight, unsympathetic smile and simply stated that the chief executive was highly unavailable to scam artists. Brandon tried to puff out his chest and argue, but the security guard stepped forward, leaving him absolutely no choice. I watched the live feed with immense satisfaction as Brandon and Brittany were unceremoniously escorted out the front doors, right back into the freezing Colorado elements. Because of the sudden cancellation and Brandon's aggressive behavior toward the staff, the valet team had simply dumped their massive pile of heavy luggage on the icy curb. There were no courtesy shuttles offered to blacklisted guests. A heavy snowstorm was rapidly moving in, and the local luxury car services were completely booked for the evening. Through the exterior security cameras, I watched the so-called power couple forced to drag their own heavy trunks through the thick gray slush. Brittany was sobbing loudly, her expensive fur coat getting ruined by the sleet while Brandon slipped and stumbled on the ice, cursing wildly into the howling wind. They trudged for nearly a mile down the dark, freezing highway until they finally reached the only accommodation with a vacancy, a dingy, cheap motel with a flickering neon vacancy sign. They stood shivering under the buzzing green light, looking absolutely miserable and completely defeated. Just as Brandon reached into his pocket to pay for a budget room with whatever cash he had left, his phone chimed with a high-priority notification. I knew exactly what the message said because I had instructed Terrence to coordinate the timing flawlessly. It was an urgent email from Brandon's primary commercial lender. They were officially calling in a $20 million business loan, and they were demanding immediate full repayment by Friday afternoon. The $20 million demand was not a request. It was an execution order. I watched through my secure feed as his arrogant posture completely collapsed. He dropped his expensive leather weekender bag onto the slushy pavement and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. Brittany was shivering violently next to him, loudly complaining about the smell of the motel and demanding he call a private helicopter service. Brandon snapped. He spun around and screamed at his new bride to shut her mouth, his voice echoing off the cheap stucco walls. The honeymoon was officially over before it even began. There were no private jets or first-class suites waiting for them the next morning. With his credit cards declining and his bank accounts frozen, Brandon was forced to use Brittany's nearly maxed-out emergency card just to book 2 middle seats on a budget commercial airline flying back to New York. I tracked their flight status with a cup of hot tea in my hand, imagining Brittany's horror at being crammed next to the lavatory, while Brandon frantically tried to calculate a way out of his impending financial doom. He was a cornered rat, and I knew exactly what his next move would be. He was going to look for a scapegoat, and he was going to look for an accomplice. The moment their flight landed at JFK, Brandon did not even bother dropping his luggage at his apartment. He took a cab directly to his corporate office and marched straight into Terrence's suite. Terrence was already packing up his desk, fully aware of the catastrophic margin calls hitting the firm's accounts. Brandon slammed the door shut, pulled the blinds down, and began pacing the room like a maniac. He did not ask for help. He demanded it. He ordered Terrence to immediately manipulate the firm's forensic accounting numbers. He needed Terrence to cook the books, inflate their severely depleted asset valuations, and bury the massive craters of toxic debt. Brandon's plan was to use the falsified ledgers to secure an emergency high-interest bridge loan from a private shadow lender to cover the $20 million deficit by Friday. Terrence sat back in his chair, folding his hands on his desk. He looked at his brother-in-law with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Terrence was a man of impeccable ethics, a brilliant mind who had worked twice as hard as Brandon to earn his place in the financial sector. He flatly and unequivocally refused the order. He told Brandon that he would not commit federal fraud to save a sinking ship built on lies. That was when Brandon's true ugly nature surfaced. Desperation stripped away his polished country club facade, revealing the venomous bigotry beneath. Brandon slammed his hands on Terrence's desk, leaning in close. He lowered his voice into a vicious snarl and told Terrence that he owed the family this favor. Brandon threw Megan's name in his face, implying with heavy racist undertones that Terrence should be eternally grateful that a prestigious, wealthy family had allowed him to marry into their elite circle. He treated Terrence not as a peer, not as family, but as the hired help who was expected to blindly clean up his mess out of sheer gratitude. Terrence did not raise his voice. He simply stood up, towering over the panicked groom, and calmly told Brandon to get out of his office before he called building security. Brandon backed away, realizing he had pushed too far, but he threw one final threat over his shoulder, promising to destroy Terrence's career right alongside mine. As soon as the door clicked shut, Terrence locked it. He knew Brandon was unstable and capable of dragging everyone into the abyss. Terrence accessed the firm's deepest, most restricted servers. Moving with forensic precision, he bypassed Brandon's rudimentary security blocks and downloaded the actual unmanipulated corporate ledgers. He copied every single hidden file, every illegal transfer, and every shred of evidence proving the massive Ponzi scheme onto a highly encrypted flash drive. He was not going to let a desperate racist fraud pin the blame on innocent people. 2 hours later, my secure phone vibrated with an encrypted text message. Terrence asked to meet me immediately at a discreet, independent coffee shop tucked away in a quiet alley in Brooklyn, far from the prying eyes of the financial district. I arrived 15 minutes early wearing a dark trench coat and a silk scarf, taking a seat in a dimly lit corner booth. Terrence walked in, looking utterly exhausted, carrying a heavy leather satchel. He slid into the booth across from me and did not bother ordering a drink. He looked me dead in the eye, his expression grave. He warned me that Brandon was completely unhinged and actively orchestrating a smear campaign to save his own skin. Brandon was compiling fabricated documents to take to the authorities, planning to officially blame his total financial ruin on me. He was going to tell the regulators that I had been embezzling millions of dollars from the firm's client accounts during the course of our relationship, painting me as a criminal mastermind who had drained him dry and fled. Terrence reached into his jacket pocket and slid a small silver flash drive across the scratched wooden table. He told me he was not going to let Brandon ruin my life or use me as a human shield. He explained that the files on the drive were the unedited raw ledgers. They were the smoking gun. They definitively proved that Brandon was running a massive Ponzi scheme, shuffling client money to cover his own disastrous personal investments. The evidence was irrefutable. I thanked Terrence, slipped the drive into my pocket, and promised him that he and Megan would be fully protected from the fallout. I left the coffee shop, stepping into the brisk evening air with the final nail for Brandon's coffin resting securely in the palm of my hand. When I returned to my penthouse, I immediately plugged the flash drive into my secure laptop. I bypassed the encryption and opened the primary folder Terrence had flagged. It contained the emergency bailout application Brandon had frantically filed just moments after leaving Terrence's office. Brandon was begging for $25 million to save himself from total annihilation. I scrolled down to the recipient line, my eyes scanning the name of the private last resort shadow lender he had blindly submitted the application to. A cold, victorious smile crept across my face. He had submitted his desperate plea to Thorn Global, my company. He was begging me for the rope I was about to hang him with. I locked the encrypted flash drive in my wall safe, savoring the profound irony that Brandon was currently begging my own company for his survival. The next morning, I had far more important matters to attend to than his impending financial execution. I was scheduled for a private lunch at the Oakmont Country Club, a notoriously impenetrable old money fortress in the heart of the city that required a rigorous vetting process just to step past the valet stand. I wore a tailored ivory suit completely unbranded but undeniably bespoke, and handed the keys of my town car to the head valet. I did not realize I had picked up a pair of shadows. As I stepped into the grand marble-floored lobby, breathing in the scent of fresh lilies and polished brass, A shrill, grating voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling, instantly shattering the refined quiet of the room. "Are you actually desperate enough to show your face here?" I turned slowly. Marching across the pristine marble were Diane and Megan Brandon's mother and sister. They were glaring at me with identical expressions of triumphant malice. They had apparently been stalking me since I left my apartment building, desperate to witness the financial ruin they assumed I was suffering. "Well, look what the cat dragged into the service entrance," Diane sneered, stopping a few feet away from me. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my suit with obvious disdain. "Let me guess, you heard they were hiring banquet waitresses for the upcoming gala. I hate to break it to you, Meredith, but they don't hire people with your kind of toxic, desperate baggage." Megan stepped forward, crossing her arms. She was carrying a counterfeit designer handbag that she aggressively thrust forward to ensure I noticed it. "Brandon canceled your credit cards, Meredith. We know you're broke. You don't belong in a zip code like this anymore. You need to pack whatever cheap clothes you have left and get out of the state before my brother completely crushes you." I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply observed them. They were so consumed by their own fabricated reality, so deeply invested in Brandon's house of cards, that they had lost all connection to actual reality. Diane leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a harsh, mocking whisper. "Brandon is closing a massive corporate merger today. He is about to become a billionaire. Brittany's family is real society, and they are opening doors for him that you couldn't even peek through. You are nothing but a pathetic footnote in his success story." The sheer staggering irony of her words almost made me laugh out loud. Diane was bragging about a billionaire merger, while her son was simultaneously running a criminal Ponzi scheme, drowning in $25 million of toxic debt, and blindly begging my corporation for a high-interest lifeline to avoid federal prison. "If you're quite finished," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, "I have a table waiting." I turned on my heel and walked purposefully across the lobby toward the heavy, frosted glass doors of the Platinum Dining Room. It was an ultra-exclusive enclave within the already exclusive club, a room strictly reserved for the highest tier of global power brokers. "Don't you walk away when I am speaking to you," Diane barked, her temper flaring as she and Megan hurried to follow me. "You can't go in there. That's members only." As I approached the entrance, the two massive, impeccably dressed security guards flanking the doors immediately stepped aside, offering me synchronized, respectful nods. I glided through the threshold. Diane and Megan attempted to barrel right in behind me. "Excuse me, ladies." The two guards stepped seamlessly back into the center of the doorway, crossing their arms and forming an impenetrable human wall of solid muscle and tailored wool. "This area is strictly reserved for Platinum members and their invited guests." The lead guard stated, his tone polite, but absolutely final. Diane's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the guard. "My son is Brandon Pierce. He is a top-tier hedge fund manager. We belong here, and that woman is just a scam artist applying for a waitress job." The guard did not even blink. He smoothly retrieved a digital tablet from his jacket pocket, tapped the screen a few times, and looked back down at Diane with icy professional detachment. "I have no record of a Brandon Pierce in our global registry, ma'am. Not even on the preliminary wait list. I must ask you to step away from the Platinum entrance immediately." Trapped in the lobby, Diane and Megan pressed their faces against the ornate glass panels of the double doors, like angry children locked outside a candy store. Through the frosted glass, they had a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of the center table. They watched in absolute paralyzed shock as the man waiting at the table stood up the moment I approached. It was the mayor of New York. He didn't just greet me. He offered a wide, deferential smile, shook my hand warmly with both of his, and personally pulled out my chair so I could sit down. I settled into my seat, smoothing my napkin over my lap, and glanced briefly toward the glass doors. Diane's mouth was hanging wide open. Megan looked as if she had just seen a ghost. The arrogant smirks had been entirely wiped from their faces, replaced by a profound, terrifying confusion. They simply could not compute the visual evidence unfolding right in front of their eyes. The lunch was highly productive. The mayor was pitching a $500 million urban redevelopment bond, and he desperately needed the financial backing and logistical infrastructure that only my corporation could underwrite. The proposal revitalizing three major commercial districts previously abandoned by predatory real estate developers. The ask, a massive capital injection and exclusive developmental oversight. The leverage complete rezoning authority granted directly to my executive board. I spent the hour dissecting his economic projections, completely ignoring the two women I knew were still pacing the lobby like trapped animals. They were too stubborn and far too nosy to leave without demanding an explanation for what they had just witnessed. An hour and a half later, the check was quietly handled by the mayor's chief of staff, and the meeting concluded. The mayor, ever the consummate politician securing a massive victory for his city, insisted on personally walking me out to my waiting car. As the heavy glass doors of the platinum dining room swung open, I saw Diane and Megan instantly freeze near the valet stand. They had been lying in wait, their eyes burning with a desperate need to corner me. But as I walked out side by side with the mayor, their aggressive posture withered into panicked hesitation. They didn't know whether to shout or hide. The mayor, noticing the two women staring fixedly at us, paused. Assuming they were either constituents, colleagues, or associates of mine waiting to pay their respects, he turned on his signature charismatic political charm. He stepped directly toward them, extending a warm, confident hand. "You ladies must be so proud to work with her," the mayor said casually, his voice booming across the quiet marble lobby. "William Thorne raised an absolutely brilliant daughter." The heavy silence that followed was deafening. The color instantly drained from Megan's face, leaving her skin a sickly ashen gray. Her jaw went completely slack, and she physically stumbled backward a half step as the catastrophic weight of that name finally registered in her mind. Megan could barely breathe. The syllables of William Thorne's name hung in the pristine air of the country club lobby like a death sentence. She grabbed Diane by the forearm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into her mother's cashmere sleeve, and physically dragged her toward the heavy glass exit doors. Diane protested, demanding to know what was happening and why they were retreating from a woman she considered beneath them, but Megan did not answer. She could not speak. Her mind was racing through every single interaction she had ever had with Meredith, every condescending remark, every time she had mocked her practical wardrobe. William Thorne was not just a wealthy man. He was an apex predator in the global financial ecosystem, a man whose shadow corporation dictated the rise and fall of entire international markets. And Meredith was his daughter. Megan shoved her mother into the back of a waiting taxi and barked the address of Brandon's corporate headquarters to the driver. The ride through the bustling city streets felt agonizingly slow. Diane continued to complain about the sudden departure, entirely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging right above their family's collective neck. Megan ignored her, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone and bypassed the receptionist, badging straight through the security gates of Brandon's firm. She burst through the heavy oak doors of Brandon's corner office without knocking. Brandon was leaning casually against his mahogany desk, a crystal glass of scotch in his hand, laughing at something Brittany was showing him on her phone. Brittany was draped across the leather sofa, adjusting her massive diamond engagement ring and looking thoroughly pleased with herself. The atmosphere was sickeningly relaxed, completely disconnected from the catastrophic reality brewing just outside their walls. Brandon glared at his sister, instantly irritated by the intrusion. He slammed his glass down and demanded to know why she was bursting into his private sanctuary like a lunatic. Megan did not bother with pleasantries. She practically hyperventilated as she blurted out the events at the country club. She described the impenetrable security, the ultra-exclusive dining room, and the moment the mayor of New York stood up to pull out Meredith's chair. Finally, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper, Megan repeated the mayor's exact parting words. She told Brandon that Meredith was William Thorne's brilliant daughter. The silence in the opulent office lasted exactly 3 seconds before Brandon threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. It was a harsh, arrogant sound, completely devoid of genuine amusement. He shook his head, looking at his sister with absolute pity. He told Megan she was being incredibly gullible. He paced across the Persian rug, weaving a narrative entirely constructed from his own massive ego and deep-seated misogyny. Brandon confidently declared that Meredith was nothing more than a desperate broke consultant who was clearly playing a pathetic game of smoke and mirrors. He arrogantly claimed that Meredith had probably slept with an aging wealthy politician to secure a fancy lunch reservation just to make him jealous. He spun a ridiculous theory that she had paid the club staff to stage the entire scene, completely refusing to accept the reality that the woman he had discarded was actually financial royalty. Brandon told his sister that William Thorne was a notoriously private billionaire who would never let his heir walk around wearing unbranded sweaters and driving a practical sedan. In Brandon's twisted status, obsessed mind true wealth was always loud, flashy, and obnoxious, much like his own. Brittany chimed in, eager to validate her new husband and secure her own precarious position at the top of the social ladder. She scoffed, rolling her eyes and examining her manicure. She loudly bragged that Meredith was just a pathetic ex trying to claw her way back into relevance. Brittany proudly reminded everyone in the room that her father's $5 million capital injection was the only real tangible wealth that mattered. She declared that her family's money was actively keeping the firm afloat and ensuring their luxurious lifestyle, proving once and for all that Brandon had traded up for a true society heiress. She sneered that Meredith could play pretend with politicians all day, but cash in the bank was the only true measure of power. Brandon smiled, wrapping his arm around Brittany and kissing her cheek, thoroughly comforted by her absolute delusion. He told Megan to stop panicking over a desperate woman's pathetic stunt and focus on the massive merger he was supposedly finalizing. He believed his own lies so completely that he genuinely felt untouchable. Right in the middle of their mocking laughter, Brandon's private cell phone began to ring. The harsh electronic tone cut through the smug atmosphere of the office. He glanced at the screen expecting a congratulatory call from an associate. Instead, the caller ID displayed Brittany's father's personal cell number. Brandon offered his new bride a triumphant wink, answering the phone with his smoothest, most arrogant corporate greeting, ready to accept praise from his wealthy benefactor. He did not get the chance to speak a second sentence. The voice exploding through the receiver was not offering congratulations. Brittany's father was screaming in absolute unhinged panic. The volume was so loud that both Megan and Brittany could hear the frantic shrieking echoing across the quiet room. The man sounded like he was hyperventilating, his words tumbling out in a terrifying rush of pure financial terror. He revealed that his entire corporate empire was collapsing in real time. His company's stock had just tanked by 40% in a single hour, triggering catastrophic automated sell-offs across the board. The reason for the sudden plunge was absolutely devastating. Thorne Global, the primary financial backer for his entire regional network, had suddenly and aggressively withdrawn all their funding without a single word of warning. They had pulled the plug, severing all credit lines, and immediately demanding full repayment on every outstanding commercial loan. Brittany's father screamed that he was facing total bankruptcy by the end of the business day. He was sobbing into the phone, demanding that Brandon immediately wire back the $5 million dowry he had transferred the morning of the wedding. He begged Brandon to return the cash, stating it was the only liquid capital he had left to stave off the federal regulators who were already circling his sinking company. Brandon stood completely paralyzed behind his desk. The smug, arrogant grin melted from his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, sickening dread. The phone trembled in his sweaty grip as his father-in-law continued to scream for the $5 million. Brandon could not speak. He could not form the words to tell the desperate man on the other end of the line that the money was completely gone. He had already spent every single cent covering his own toxic margin calls just to keep his fraudulent Ponzi scheme from exploding. He was completely out of cash, out of leverage, and out of time. The phone slipped from his sweat-slicked fingers, clattering against the polished mahogany desk. Brittany's father was still screaming through the tiny speaker, his voice a distorted, tinny screech of impending financial doom. Brandon did not pick the device back up. He stared blankly at the wall, his chest heaving as the crushing reality of his situation finally breached his impenetrable ego. The $5 million was gone. It had vanished into the gaping maw of his margin calls hours ago, a futile, panicked attempt to plug a massive leak in a rapidly sinking ship. Now, not only was his hedge fund actively imploding, but his brand new father-in-law was collateral damage completely bankrupted by a single surgical strike from Thorn Global. The fallout: federal regulators were no longer just circling his firm, they were practically knocking on the lobby doors. Terrence had undoubtedly already handed the unedited raw ledgers to the authorities. Brandon knew he had less than 24 hours before the Securities and Exchange Commission formally froze his remaining phantom assets and federal marshals slapped him in handcuffs. He desperately needed a miracle. He needed liquidity massive and immediate to cover the tracks of his Ponzi scheme before the sun set. He snatched his phone from the desk, abruptly terminating the call with his hysterical father-in-law, and began pacing the length of his opulent office. He frantically scrolled through his contact list, making dozens of desperate calls. Private equity managers ignored. Shadow lenders disconnected. Old money friends sent straight to voicemail. Word was already out on Wall Street. He was entirely radioactive. There was only one institution left on the eastern seaboard with the capital velocity to bail him out of a $25 million crater, the very institution that had just gutted his new family. Thorn Global. The Hail Mary. Through a sheer stroke of desperate luck, and by leveraging an old, barely valid favor from a mid-level corporate broker, Brandon managed to secure a 10-minute emergency audience at Thorn Global headquarters. It was a strategic gamble of epic proportions. In his rapidly fracturing mind, the fact that Thorn Global had destroyed Brittany's father was just a brutal business tactic, a clear sign that William Thorn respected ruthless aggression. Brandon convinced himself that if he could just get into the room with the legendary billionaire, he could pitch a joint venture. He would sell his toxic firm as an aggressive acquisition, charming the old man with his signature country club charisma. He spun around to face Brittany. She was staring at him with wide, mascara-smudged eyes, finally sensing the absolute unhinged panic radiating from her husband. Brandon barked a vicious order at her to get off the couch. He commanded her to put on her most expensive diamonds, the heavy Cartier tennis bracelet, the custom-cut earrings, anything that screamed generational wealth. They were going to walk into Thorn Global looking like absolute royalty, not financial refugees. Brittany scrambled to obey, her hands shaking as she slipped her heavy rocks onto her wrists. Meanwhile, Brandon violently shoved a thick stack of fabricated financial reports into his designer leather briefcase. These were the cooked books, the meticulously forged documents detailing a highly profitable, perfectly sound hedge fund. It was an outright lie printed on heavy cardstock, and he was planning to hand it directly to the most powerful man in the city, the Thorn Monolith. They rushed downtown to the financial district, pulling up to the towering glass and steel monolith that housed Thorn Global. The building was an architectural masterpiece, a physical manifestation of absolute untouchable power. Brandon adjusted his silk tie through his shoulders back and plastered on his trademark arrogant smirk. He grabbed Brittany by the arm and marched through the heavy revolving doors as if he legally owned the pavement beneath his feet. The grand lobby was breathtakingly intimidating. It was minimalist, aggressive, and completely silent, save for the synchronized clicking of polished leather shoes. Brandon strode directly to the executive reception desk, a massive slab of black marble manned by a sharply dressed woman who looked at him with bored professional detachment. Brandon slapped his leather briefcase onto the marble counter. He puffed out his chest, leaning over the stone, and demanded to be taken up to the executive suite immediately. He loudly announced his name, ensuring the impeccably dressed security personnel flanking the elevators heard him. He declared that he was there to present a highly lucrative multi-million-dollar acquisition portfolio directly to William Thorn. He acted like a king gracing a peasant, with his presence flashing a bright, deeply empty smile. The receptionist did not flinch. She did not offer a sycophantic smile or apologize for the wait. She calmly reached out and took the leather briefcase directly from his hands. She unclasped the lock, briefly glanced at the first page of his fraudulent portfolio, and then snapped it shut. She looked back up at Brandon with cold, dead eyes. She informed him in a tone dripping with icy professionalism that William Thorne did not take unscheduled pitches from sinking hedge funds. However, she noted that the executive board had been closely anticipating his arrival. She stated that the firm's vice president of acquisitions would personally review his financial portfolio to determine if his company was worth salvaging from total bankruptcy. Brandon's arrogant facade twitched, a flash of severe irritation crossing his features. He hated dealing with subordinates, but he knew he was in absolutely no position to argue. He aggressively adjusted his cuffs, leaning heavily against the marble desk, and offered a loud, condescending sigh. He casually asked for the vice president's name, preparing to exert his dominance over whatever corporate middle manager was about to walk through the security gates. The receptionist's cold expression suddenly shifted. A sharp, knowing smile curled the edges of her dark lips. She tapped her polished fingernail against the cover of his fabricated portfolio and looked Brandon squarely in the eye. "Meredith Thorne. She will see you now." Brandon stared at the receptionist, a harsh, incredulous laugh bursting from his throat. He slapped his hand against the black marble counter, shaking his head as if he had just been told the most ridiculous, poorly timed joke on Wall Street. He loudly insisted that there must be a catastrophic mistake in their corporate directory. Leaning over the desk, he adopted a patronizing, overly enunciated tone, explaining to the stoic woman that his ex-wife happened to share the same first name, but she was nothing more than a poor, struggling freelance consultant who practically lived out of a suitcase. He arrogantly stated that there were probably thousands of women named Meredith in the city, and he did not have the time or the patience to deal with administrative mix-ups. He demanded that she stop playing games, pick up the phone, and call the actual vice president down before he reported her to executive management for gross incompetence. Brittany immediately rushed forward to support her husband's fragile ego. She crossed her arms, her heavy diamond bracelets clanking loudly together, and let out a theatrical whining sigh. She loudly complained to the nearby security guards that it was absolutely absurd to keep a man of Brandon's financial caliber waiting while a minimum-wage receptionist struggled to operate a basic computer system. Brittany rolled her eyes, openly sneering at the woman behind the desk, and proclaimed that Thorne Global clearly needed to completely overhaul its human resources department if this was the standard of service they offered to high-net-worth clients. Brandon nodded in agreement, adjusting his silk tie and loudly proclaiming that William Thorne himself would be utterly appalled to see how his VIP guests were treated in the main lobby. I heard their obnoxious, echoing voices the moment the private executive elevator began its descent. I stood quietly in the mirrored carriage, flanked by 4 senior directors, listening to Brandon publicly humiliate himself through the lobby's pristine acoustic architecture. The heavy steel doors slid open with a soft chime revealing the expansive sunlit atrium. I stepped out, moving with absolute unbothered precision. I was dressed in an immaculate razor-sharp Tom Ford power suit, my hair perfectly styled, my posture projecting the exact kind of untouchable authority that Brandon had spent his entire adult life trying to fake. My executive team flanked me in a tight protective formation. We moved across the pristine marble floor as a unified front, actively discussing the final restructuring terms of a massive global acquisition. I held a digital tablet, effortlessly issuing directives and dismissing a regional managing director with a single authoritative nod. I did not look for Brandon. I did not need to. His desperate, frantic energy was practically vibrating across the room, polluting the refined atmosphere of my building. Brandon spotted me from the reception desk. I watched from the corner of my eye as his brain completely short-circuited. Instead of processing the obvious visual reality that I was leading a team of high-level executives, his suffocating, blinding narcissism desperately kicked in to protect his shattered ego. In his warped mind, seeing me with a tablet meant I was carrying someone else's schedule. Seeing me in a corporate building meant I had begged for an entry-level position. He genuinely convinced himself that I had somehow tracked his calendar, secured a low-level secretarial job, and was using it to intercept him. He shoved himself away from the marble counter, leaving a confused Brittany standing behind, and strode aggressively across the lobby to intercept my path. He did not care that he was in the headquarters of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He did not care that heavily armed security guards were watching his every single move. He only cared about asserting his dominance over the woman he thought he had broken. He stepped directly into my path, forcing my entire executive team to abruptly halt their momentum. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me with a sickening, familiar smirk that made my blood run cold. He arrogantly crossed his arms and looked me up and down, completely ignoring the powerful men and women standing shoulder to shoulder with me. "Did you really get a job here as a secretary just to stalk me?" He reached out his hand, wrapping aggressively around my upper arm to physically stop me from walking past him. He squeezed tightly, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric of my suit, attempting to physically intimidate me into shrinking back into the submissive, quiet woman he thought he had married. He leaned in, his breath washing over my face, and prepared to deliver another venomous insult to put me in my place. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply looked down at his hand gripping my arm, my expression completely devoid of fear, mirroring the absolute zero temperature of the room. Before Brandon could utter another syllable, the man standing directly to my right stepped forward. It was Arthur Sterling, the chief financial officer of Thorn Global, a man who personally managed hundreds of billions of dollars and possessed a legendary temper that terrified Wall Street veterans. Arthur did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply glared at Brandon with a look of such profound, lethal disgust that the air in the lobby seemed to instantly freeze. Arthur stepped directly into Brandon's personal space, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that echoed perfectly in the sudden, dead silence of the lobby. "Take your hands off our future CEO, you pathetic scam artist." Brandon's fingers instantly went numb. His hand dropped from my arm as if he had been physically burned. The arrogant, mocking smirk entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, hollow mask of absolute terror, as the crushing, inescapable reality of his situation finally obliterated his delusion. Meredith stepped back, smoothing the immaculate sleeve of her Tom Ford suit, where his sweaty fingers had just been. Arthur Sterling remained planted firmly between them, a towering wall of bespoke wool and institutional fury, waiting for her command. Meredith looked at Brandon's ashen face, then at Brittany, who had crept up behind him, her jaw practically unhinged as she stared at the entourage of executives flanking her former rival. The heavy diamond bracelets on Brittany's wrists suddenly looked like cheap costume jewelry against the backdrop of true generational power. Meredith offered them both a sterile, utterly detached smile. She gestured toward the massive glass-walled boardroom at the end of the atrium. She told Brandon that since he had come all this way to present his acquisition portfolio, it would be terribly rude of Thorn Global to deny him an audience. She instructed him to step inside so they could discuss the future of his hedge fund. Brandon stumbled forward like a man walking to his own execution. His legs moved mechanically, his expensive Italian leather shoes dragging across the polished marble floor as if they were filled with lead. Brittany clutched his arm, her eyes darting frantically around the imposing space, the reality of her family's sudden bankruptcy finally connecting to the woman she had spent months ridiculing. Meredith led the way into the boardroom. The space was a breathtaking expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking the financial district, anchored by a massive polished obsidian table that seemed to absorb the light in the room. Her executive team filed in behind her, taking their seats with practiced, intimidating silence. Arthur sat to her immediate right, crossing his arms and fixing Brandon with a predatory glare that promised absolute destruction. Meredith took the head of the table, placing Brandon's fabricated leather briefcase directly in the center. She motioned for them to sit. Brandon practically collapsed into the ergonomic leather chair, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw oxygen into his panicked lungs. The heavy glass doors slid shut, sealing the room in a pressurized, soundproof vacuum. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ragged, shallow breathing of the man sitting across from her. Brandon stared at Meredith from across the obsidian expanse, a thick bead of sweat tracing a line down his pale temple. His survival instincts, honed by years of manipulating everyone around him, desperately kicked in. He leaned forward, bracing his shaking hands on the table edge, and attempted the most pathetic pivot imaginable. His voice dropped to a frantic, pleading whisper, completely ignoring the executives surrounding them, who were watching his meltdown with cold, analytical precision. He told Meredith that everything he had done was a terrible, tragic misunderstanding. He looked at Brittany, who was sitting right next to him, with absolute revulsion, then looked back at Meredith with wide, begging eyes. He blatantly claimed that he never loved his new bride. He swore that he only married Brittany because her father had the $5 million he desperately needed to keep his firm afloat during a temporary liquidity crisis. He tried to gaslight Meredith right there in front of the board of directors, spinning a sickening narrative that he had secured that capital solely to protect their shared assets to build a financial fortress for their future. He whispered that Meredith was the only woman he had ever truly loved, insisting that his marriage to Brittany was nothing more than a strategic business transaction. He begged Meredith to see that his betrayal, his cruelty, and his deceit were actually misguided acts of devotion aimed at securing their ultimate future together. Brittany gasped, her face flushing a violently angry shade of crimson. The sheer audacity of his betrayal momentarily paralyzed her before she exploded. She slapped Brandon hard on the shoulder, shrieking that he was a manipulative liar and a coward, screaming about her father's ruined company and the wedding vows they had taken just days ago. Brandon furiously shoved her hand away, his facade cracking as he violently ordered her to shut her mouth and stop acting like a hysterical child. He turned his desperate, begging eyes back to Meredith, entirely abandoning his new bride, waiting for his signature charm to magically erase the years of emotional abuse, financial sabotage, and outright betrayal he had inflicted upon her. Meredith did not blink. She did not offer a single word of response to his repulsive, pathetic confession. She let the silence stretch, forcing him to stew in the toxic humiliation of his own making. Instead of answering, she calmly picked up her digital tablet from the desk. She tapped a single button on the screen. The lights in the boardroom instantly dimmed, and a massive high-definition projector screen descended from the ceiling directly behind her with a low, mechanical hum. The projector flared to life, casting a bright, unforgiving light across Brandon's terrified face. The massive screen split into two distinct displays. On the left side, the high-resolution projection showcased the exact contents of the leather briefcase he had just handed to the receptionist 10 minutes ago. It displayed the meticulously forged balance sheets, the inflated asset valuations, and the entirely fabricated profit margins of his hedge fund. On the right side of the screen, the display highlighted the raw, unedited forensic accounting files that Terrence had extracted from Brandon's private servers just hours earlier. The glaring, irrefutable evidence of his massive, toxic Ponzi scheme was magnified for the entire executive board to see. The projection exposed his hidden offshore shell companies, the devastating margin calls, and the undeniable proof that he had been stealing client funds to cover his catastrophic losses. The contrast between the lie he was selling and the devastating reality of his crimes was presented in undeniable neon clarity. Arthur Sterling leaned forward, tapping a gold pen against the table, his eyes locked onto the massive deficit glowing on the screen. The other executives began taking notes, their faces masks of professional disgust as they analyzed the sheer scale of his financial fraud. Brandon choked on his own breath. He violently pushed his chair back, scrambling to his feet as he stared at the projected documents. His eyes darted frantically between his fake numbers and the undeniable proof of his criminal enterprise. The trap had closed perfectly. He had walked directly into Thorn Global headquarters and voluntarily handed over the murder weapon. Meredith locked her eyes onto his, letting the absolute freezing reality of his destruction wash over him. "You just committed federal wire fraud by submitting these to my company," Meredith stated coldly. "And the penalty for that is 20 years in federal prison." The glaring digits on the massive projector screen illuminated Brandon's horrified face in a harsh, unforgiving blue light. The words detailing his impending 20-year federal prison sentence echoed through the pressurized silence of the glass-walled boardroom. His jaw hung slack, his vocal cords completely seized, rendering him unable to formulate a single coherent syllable to counter the undeniable, staggering mountain of evidence documenting his massive criminal fraud. Brittany sat frozen beside him, her manicured nails digging so deeply into the expensive mahogany veneer of the table that her knuckles turned stark white. The reality of her new husband's absolute inescapable ruin was finally piercing through her blinding vanity. Before the crushing gravity of Meredith's threat could fully paralyze him, the heavy, soundproofed double doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open with a forceful, commanding swoosh. The synchronized, immediate turning of every executive's head signaled the arrival of absolute power. William Thorne stepped over the threshold. He did not merely walk into the room, he glided with the terrifying predatory grace of an apex predator casually inspecting his domain. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal gray suit that radiated generations of old money and untouchable influence, his piercing steel blue eyes immediately scanned the length of the obsidian table. The atmosphere in the boardroom instantly shifted. The air grew thinner, heavier. Arthur Sterling and the other high-level executives instinctively straightened their postures, a silent, unified display of absolute deference to the billionaire patriarch. Brandon's fractured, desperate mind saw a lifeline. His pathological narcissism, severely battered but stubbornly refusing to die, sparked one final, completely suicidal gambit. He willfully ignored the glaring evidence of his own multiple felonies glowing brightly on the wall behind Meredith. He forcefully shoved his chair back, his expensive Italian leather shoes squeaking loudly against the polished floor, and scrambled aggressively toward the doorway. He practically lunged at the billionaire, throwing his arms wide open in a pathetic, desperate display of manufactured camaraderie. He attempted to leverage the toxic old boys club charm that had fueled his entire fraudulent career, loudly and frantically interrupting the silent, fearful reverence of the boardroom. He begged William to ignore the presentation on the screen, frantically pointing at Meredith with a trembling, accusatory finger. He spewed a frantic, disjointed narrative claiming that Meredith was nothing more than a deeply bitter, unstable ex-wife who had somehow infiltrated the firm's lower administrative ranks. He wildly accused her of manipulating data, of hacking his secure servers, and of staging this entire elaborate presentation purely to ruin a highly lucrative, mutually beneficial business acquisition out of sheer, unadulterated jealousy. Brandon's voice pitched an octave higher as he desperately tried to sell the illusion. He swore to William that his hedge fund was an absolute gold mine, a flawless, perfectly calibrated machine generating massive yields, and that this entire spectacle was just a pathetic emotional vendetta orchestrated by a scorned woman unable to accept that he had moved on to a younger, significantly wealthier bride. William Thorne did not break his stride. He did not flinch. He did not slow his measured pace, and he did not even acknowledge Brandon's physical existence in the room. He moved past the frantic, sweating hedge fund manager as if Brandon were nothing more than a minor, distasteful smudge on the immaculate glass wall. Brandon reached out his sweaty palm, grazing the immaculate sleeve of William's jacket, desperate to force a physical connection, but a massive security operative materialized instantly from the corridor. The guard violently swatted Brandon's hand away, shoving him roughly by the shoulder back toward the center of the table. William continued his purposeful stride directly to the head of the room. He stopped right beside Meredith, the imposing, ruthless billionaire, a man who regularly dismantled global corporations and bankrupted foreign economies before his morning coffee suddenly softened. The sharp, terrifying ice in his steel blue eyes melted into genuine, profound affection. He leaned down gently, placed his large hands on Meredith's shoulders, and pressed a warm, fatherly kiss to her cheek. He looked up at the glowing projector screen, quickly scanning the complex forensic accounting data, detailing Brandon's complete financial destruction, and offered a sharp, deeply satisfied nod. He turned back to Meredith, his voice carrying the deep, resonant timbre of absolute, unquestionable authority. "Excellent work, exposing the rot, my daughter." The syllables hit Brandon like a physical barrage of concrete blocks. The air violently evacuated his lungs, his knees buckled entirely beneath him, suddenly unable to support the crushing, suffocating weight of his absolute total humiliation. He collapsed backward into the ergonomic leather chair, his body going completely limp. He stared at the billionaire patriarch and the woman he had discarded like trash, his mind finally brutally snapping as the undeniable reality of his situation set in. He could not breathe. His chest heaved in frantic shallow gasps as the walls of his fraudulent empire completely incinerated around him. He had not just tried to scam a faceless international corporation. He had actively attempted to defraud the fiercely protective father of the woman he had spent years emotionally abusing and financially sabotaging. He was utterly, permanently, and spectacularly ruined. He slouched down his chin, resting on his chest, staring at the floor as his heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. William Thorne slowly turned his attention away from his brilliant daughter and the shattered, hyperventilating remains of Brandon's ego. His gaze drifted across the wide expanse of the obsidian table, locking directly onto Brittany. She was completely paralyzed, pressing herself as far back into her chair as physically possible. Her heavy diamond earrings trembled violently against her neck, the brilliant facets catching the light from the projector. The smug, entitled arrogance she had proudly paraded through the country club dining room and the corporate lobby was completely eradicated. It was replaced by the sheer paralyzing terror of a woman realizing she was trapped in a soundproof room with the executioner of her family's entire legacy. William's expression hardened instantly, returning to the terrifying, emotionless mask of the corporate titan. He casually adjusted his platinum cufflinks, staring down at Brittany with a look of profound, chilling indifference. He did not raise his voice. He did not show a single ounce of pity for the trembling, terrified woman sitting across from him. He delivered the final fatal blow with the casual efficiency of a man crossing a minor item off a daily agenda. "By the way," William said ruthlessly, the sound of his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the boardroom, "tell your father I am calling in the remaining loans. Your family is officially bankrupt as of 3 p.m. today." The echo of William Thorne's devastating decree hung in the pressurized air of the glass-walled boardroom. The absolute finality of his words paralyzed the room. Brittany sat perfectly still, her breath trapped in her throat, as the sheer magnitude of the statement violently penetrated her carefully curated reality. Her family was bankrupt. The generational wealth, the country club memberships, the sprawling estates, the unlimited credit lines, all of it was completely obliterated. She turned her neck slowly, the joints practically creaking under the sudden immense tension, to look at the man she had proudly tethered her entire existence to just days ago. Brandon was slumped in his ergonomic leather chair, a hollow, sweating shell of a human being. He did not offer a reassuring lie. He did not puff out his chest, flash his arrogant smirk, or threaten aggressive litigation against the Thorne Empire. He was staring blankly at the floor, his face the color of wet ash, his breath wheezing through his nose in pathetic, shallow gasps. He was completely, undeniably defeated. The illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces, cutting through Brittany's profound vanity. The $5 million capital injection from her father was not a strategic seed for a joint financial empire. It was a desperate, fleeting bandage applied to a fatal, gaping wound. She had not married a master of the universe. She had married a broke, desperate con artist. And in her blind status, obsessed greed, she had dragged her own family's entire fortune straight into the corporate incinerator. A visceral, animalistic rage erupted from deep within her chest. Brittany sprang from her chair with terrifying, unhinged speed. She lunged at Brandon, her arms swinging in a wide, vicious arc. The slap sounded like a gunshot in the pristine acoustic environment of the boardroom. Her palm struck his cheekbone with maximum velocity, the heavy platinum and diamond Cartier bracelets on her wrist slicing across his skin. Brandon cried out a pathetic, high-pitched yelp of shock and pain, recoiling violently in his seat as a thin line of bright red blood instantly welled up along his cheek. He threw his hands up to protect his face, cowering beneath his new bride. Brittany stood over him, transforming into a feral, screaming banshee. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly between his eyes, her voice echoing off the floor to ceiling windows. She shrieked that he was a parasite, a disgusting, pathological liar who had ruined her entire life. She screamed that she hated him, that he was a pathetic, poor loser, who had manipulated her family into poverty. She cursed him with every vile word she could summon, her pristine designer gown twisting around her legs as she physically kicked the leg of his chair. Arthur Sterling and the assembled executive board watched the spectacular implosion with detached clinical fascination. No one moved to intervene. They simply observed the gutter-level reality of Brandon's life exposing itself in their multi-billion-dollar sanctuary. Brandon tried to grab her wrist, begging her to calm down, frantically whispering that they were in public and that she was making a scene. His attempt to control her only fueled her absolute hysteria. She violently yanked her arm away from his sweaty grip, spitting at his feet, utterly repulsed by his very existence. Then a sudden, desperate calculation hijacked her panicked brain. Screaming at a financially ruined man would not bring her father's company back. It would not restore her credit cards or save her from the humiliating social exile awaiting her. She spun away from her bleeding husband and turned her attention to the true architects of power in the room. Brittany dropped heavily to her knees. Her kneecaps hit the polished hardwood floor with a dull thud. She abandoned every single ounce of her manufactured dignity, crawling forward until she was at the edge of the massive obsidian table, looking up at William and Meredith Thorne. Tears streamed down her face, dragging thick black tracks of expensive mascara across her cheeks, completely ruining her flawless makeup. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, begging like a desperate refugee. She looked directly at Meredith, the woman she had mercilessly mocked and ridiculed just days prior. Brittany's voice shook as she offered a frantic, rapid-fire negotiation. She swore that she had no idea about the Ponzi scheme. She claimed she was just another innocent victim of Brandon's toxic manipulation. Then she offered her absolute betrayal. She promised to turn state's evidence immediately. She frantically listed everything she could offer the Thorne executives and the federal authorities. She knew the passcode to his personal laptop. She knew the combination to the hidden wall safe in his private home office. She had overheard his late-night panicked phone calls with offshore shadow lenders and could provide names, dates, and locations. She offered to serve her husband up on a silver platter to testify against him in federal court to guarantee he spent the rest of his natural life behind bars. In exchange, she begged, she pleaded, she demanded that William Thorne reverse the margin calls on her father's company and provide a financial bailout to save her family from total ruin. Meredith looked down at the woman weeping on the floor. She observed the heavy diamond engagement ring flashing on Brittany's clasped hands, the same ring purchased with stolen funds. She remembered the condescending sneers at the country club, the loud bragging about the $5 million dowry, the absolute certainty with which Brittany had dismissed her as a pathetic broke ex-wife. Meredith did not gloat. She did not smile. She did not raise her voice to match Brittany's chaotic energy. She simply stared down at her with absolute freezing disgust. She saw nothing but a parasitic opportunist entirely devoid of loyalty, attempting to trade her husband's freedom for a continuation of her unearned luxury. Meredith reached out and tapped a single button on her digital communication tablet. Throw her out. She's no longer relevant. Two massive, broad-shouldered corporate security guards materialized instantly from the corridor. They stepped into the boardroom with silent efficiency, ignoring the crying woman's designer attire. They grabbed Brittany firmly under her upper arms, lifting her completely off the floor. Brittany shrieked, her legs kicking wildly in the air, her expensive heels scraping against the polished wood. She thrashed against the guards' iron grips, screaming that they had a deal, begging Meredith to listen to her, promising she could ruin Brandon completely. Her frantic, hysterical pleas echoed down the pristine hallway, growing fainter and fainter, until the heavy glass doors of the boardroom hissed shut, sealing the room in total silence once again. Meredith did not watch her leave. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Brandon. He was sitting in frozen terror, his cheek bleeding, watching his wife abandon him with zero hesitation. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Meredith picked up a single pristine document from the stack in front of her. She placed her fingertips on the edge of the crisp white paper and slid it firmly across the long, smooth expanse of the obsidian table. It glided perfectly, coming to a halt directly in front of Brandon's trembling hands. It was a binding corporate buyout contract. It outlined the total unconditional surrender of his entire firm, its remaining assets, its client lists, and its intellectual property to Thorn Global. Meredith looked at his terrified, tear-streaked face, her expression completely devoid of mercy. The purchase price printed at the bottom of the page was exactly $1. Brandon stared at the single digit printed on the crisp white paper. $1. The words left his mouth as a dry, breathless croak. He stared at the ink, his brain violently rejecting the visual data presented to him. The absolute insult of the valuation acted like a high-voltage defibrillator to his dying ego. The paralyzing terror that had gripped his chest just moments ago was suddenly eclipsed by a massive, blinding surge of defensive rage. He could not be bought for $1. He was Brandon, a master of the universe, a self-made titan of the financial district. He absolutely refused to be humiliated and dismissed by a woman he had spent years convincing himself was entirely beneath him. He aggressively shoved the contract back across the smooth obsidian table. The paper glided rapidly until it hit the edge of Meredith's digital tablet, stopping dead. Brandon pushed himself out of his ergonomic chair, his muscles trembling as he braced his hands on the table, desperately trying to tower over her, trying to physically reclaim the dominance he had irrevocably lost. "I'm not signing that!" He snarled, his voice shaking with a volatile, explosive mix of panic and fury. "You think you can just steal my firm, my life's work? You think because you are sitting in your daddy's fancy boardroom surrounded by his attack dogs that you can just snap your fingers and erase me from existence?" He glared at William Thorne, then shifted his wild eyes to Arthur Sterling, his chest puffing out in a pathetic, desperate display of bravado. "This is extortion. It is corporate raiding at its most disgusting, and I will not let you take my assets for pennies on the dollar just to cover up your own predatory acquisition strategies." Meredith remained perfectly still, her hands resting elegantly on the table. She did not interrupt his meltdown. She did not defend her company. She simply watched him unravel, allowing him the necessary slack to hang himself entirely. Brandon mistook her silence for hesitation. His warped, narcissistic mind immediately latched onto this perceived weakness, fabricating a sudden, entirely delusional sense of leverage. He sneered violently, wiping a bead of sweat and smeared blood from his cheek. "You think you hold all the cards, Meredith. You think you can bully me into submission because your father has deep pockets and a heavy security detail. You forgot exactly who you are dealing with." He began to pace behind his chair, his adrenaline spiking dangerously as he constructed his counterattack on the fly, completely ignoring the reality of the forensic data still glowing on the projector screen behind them. "I have contacts at every major financial publication in this city. I know reporters at the Journal, at Bloomberg, at the Times. I will walk right out of this building and go straight to the press. I will tell them exactly how Thorn Global operates. I will leak a story so incredibly damaging it will tank your stock price before the opening bell rings tomorrow morning." He stopped pacing, pointing an accusing, trembling finger at the entire executive team. "I will expose you all as ruthless, predatory corporate raiders who actively target small independent businesses to absorb their capital. I will play the victim and the media will eat it up out of the palm of my hand. They absolutely love a David and Goliath story. I will drag your pristine family name through the mud, Meredith. I will make sure the Securities and Exchange Commission looks into your aggressive, borderline illegal acquisition tactics. You will be tied up in litigation, congressional hearings, and toxic public relations for a decade if you do not back off right now." Brandon planted his feet firmly, believing he had just delivered a masterstroke of corporate warfare. He genuinely convinced himself that he had trapped the Thorne Empire in a corner. He waited for the executives to panic, for William Thorne to intervene and reconsider the harshness of the deal, for Meredith to nervously withdraw the insulting contract and offer him a genuine multi-million-dollar severance package. Instead, the boardroom remained cloaked in a chilling, heavy silence. Arthur Sterling let out a low, gravelly scoff, a sound entirely devoid of humor and full of pure disdain. The regional managing directors exchanged brief, unimpressed glances, analyzing Brandon not as a legitimate corporate threat, but as a fascinating, pathetic study in psychological collapse. Meredith did not blink. She slowly leaned back in her high-backed leather chair, steepling her fingers together. The absolute zero temperature of the room seemed to drop even further as a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across her face. It was a smile utterly devoid of warmth, a terrifying display of absolute calculated victory. "You are going to go to the press, Brandon?" Meredith asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a surgical blade. She tilted her head slightly, regarding him with the kind of clinical fascination one might reserve for a dying insect. "You are going to walk out of this building and tell the reporters your little story. Watch me." Brandon threatened, taking a stubborn, aggressive step toward the heavy glass doors. "You will not have to walk very far," Meredith replied smoothly. She gestured gracefully toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the financial district far below. "The press is actually already here. They have been gathering outside our headquarters for the last 20 minutes. Satellite trucks, investigative reporters, live camera crews. They have completely barricaded the main plaza." Brandon halted, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his pale face. He forcefully swallowed his eyes, darting nervously toward the windows. Though from their elevation, the street level was just a gray, distant blur of concrete and traffic. "But they are not here for an exclusive interview with you about Thorn Global's acquisition strategies." Meredith continued, her voice dropping to a deadly resonant calm that paralyzed the room. "They are not here to listen to your fabricated David and Goliath story. They are not here to write an exposé on our predatory tactics." She reached across the polished obsidian table and picked up a sleek silver remote control. She did not look at Brandon as she pointed the remote toward the far wall of the boardroom. "They are here because they are waiting to film the federal agents escorting you out of my lobby in handcuffs." Meredith pressed a single button. The massive high-definition television mounted on the far wall flared to life. The audio instantly filled the soundproof boardroom, broadcasting the frantic, urgent tone of a national financial news anchor. Brandon slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto the glowing screen. The bottom of the broadcast displayed a bright red scrolling ticker tape, but it was the bold, capitalized headline dominating the center of the screen that completely vaporized the last remaining fragments of his soul. The breaking news banner flashed in glaring, unforgiving letters: "Wall Street hedge fund manager investigated by SEC for massive Ponzi scheme." The news footage abruptly cut from the studio anchor to a live aerial helicopter shot. Brandon recognized the building instantly. It was his own corporate headquarters. Dozens of dark, unmarked government vehicles were parked haphazardly across his plaza. Agents in dark windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC were visibly swarming his glass lobby, carrying out massive boxes of physical documents and rolling out heavy server racks. The anchor's voice droned on, outlining the catastrophic scale of the fraud, mentioning missing hundreds of millions, devastated client portfolios, and the imminent issuing of federal arrest warrants. Brandon's lungs stopped processing oxygen. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. The illusion of leverage, the desperate threats, the arrogant refusal to sign the contract, it all evaporated into absolute nothingness. He realized with a crushing, inescapable finality that his threats were entirely useless. He was not a corporate warrior fighting a hostile takeover. He was already the villain of national news. Two massive corporate security guards stepped forward the very second Brandon's legs ceased to function. Arthur Sterling delivered a single, sharp nod. The guards flanked the ruined hedge fund manager, gripping him forcefully under his armpits. They hauled Brandon up from the ergonomic leather chair, dragging him backward. His expensive Italian loafers scuffed uselessly against the polished floor. He did not fight them. He did not utter another threat. The horrific realization that he was walking directly into federal custody had completely lobotomized him. His jaw remained slack, his eyes wide and vacant, fixed on the high-definition screen, still broadcasting the raid on his own headquarters. Meredith watched him disappear through the heavy glass doors, his feet practically dragging behind him. She did not feel a single ounce of pity. She simply reached out, picked up the buyout contract he had refused to sign, and handed it to Arthur. She calmly instructed her chief financial officer to forward the document directly to the bankruptcy courts. The firm would be theirs by the end of the week, and they would not even have to pay the single dollar. Smoothing the immaculate lapels of her Tom Ford suit, Meredith turned and walked toward her private executive elevator. The boardroom remained in a state of clinical, calculating silence behind her. She stepped into the mirrored carriage, the heavy steel doors sliding shut with a soft chime. As the elevator began its rapid descent toward the main lobby, she allowed herself one deep, cleansing breath. The air felt lighter. The suffocating weight of Brandon's psychological warfare, the years of financial sabotage, and the toxic gaslighting were completely gone, replaced by the sterile, absolute certainty of total victory. The elevator chimed, announcing her arrival at the ground floor. The doors parted, revealing the expansive sunlit atrium of Thorn Global Headquarters. Usually a sanctuary of hushed, reverent corporate transactions, the lobby was currently buzzing with frantic, chaotic energy. Through the massive revolving glass doors, a sea of flashing red and blue lights painted the plaza. Federal agents in windbreakers were cordoning off the entrance, holding back a surging tide of aggressive paparazzi and shouting financial reporters. Meredith stepped out of the carriage, her posture radiating absolute authority. She had intended to walk directly to her waiting town car in the underground garage, but a sharp, hysterical shriek shattered the ambient noise of the lobby. Diane and Megan were standing near the main reception desk. They were surrounded by an absurd fortress of glossy shopping bags from Fifth Avenue boutiques, clearly having spent their morning enthusiastically burning through the last remaining droplets of Brandon's stolen capital. But the smug, entitled arrogance they usually wore like armor had completely evaporated. Diane was clutching her smartphone with trembling hands, staring at the live broadcast of her son's corporate raid. Her face was contorted in a mask of absolute, unadulterated panic. Megan was standing beside her, hyperventilating, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face as she frantically refreshed the news feeds on her own device. They had expected to meet Brandon for a lavish celebratory lunch after he secured his massive new acquisition. Instead, they were watching his empire burn to ash in real time. Diane's head snapped up, her eyes locked onto Meredith stepping out of the executive elevator. The older woman's brain violently short-circuited as the reality of her new impoverished existence crashed down upon her. She realized instantly that the limitless credit cards, the country club memberships, and the sprawling suburban estate were gone forever. Diane abandoned her expensive shopping bags, letting them spill across the pristine marble floor. She practically sprinted across the lobby, completely disregarding the stares of the heavily armed security personnel and the remaining corporate staff. She did not stop when she reached Meredith. She threw her entire body forward. Diane's knees hit the polished marble floor with a sickening heavy thud. She slid the last few inches, throwing her arms out and wrapping her hands violently around Meredith's ankles. She pressed her face against the razor-sharp crease of Meredith's trousers, letting out a piercing theatrical wail that echoed up to the vaulted ceiling. She began to sob, forcing thick, wet tears from her eyes, perfectly weaponizing the exact brand of maternal manipulation she had used to control her family for decades. She begged Meredith to stop this madness. She shrieked that there had to be a mistake, a terrible misunderstanding. She violently squeezed Meredith's ankles, crying crocodile tears, pleading with her to call the federal agents off, to pick up a phone and make the nightmare go away. She wailed that Brandon was a good man, that he had just made a few aggressive financial errors, and that Meredith had to remember they were all family. Diane sobbed that family protects each other loudly, begging Meredith to save her son before they locked him away and ruined their entire lives. Megan rushed forward, her own face pale and streaked with ruined mascara. She stopped just short of dropping to her knees alongside her mother, her hands clasped together in a frantic, desperate prayer. She joined the chorus of pathetic groveling, her voice cracking as she pleaded for mercy. Megan swore they would do anything Meredith asked. She promised they would publicly apologize, that they would give back every single gift Brandon had ever bought them, that they would sign whatever non-disclosure agreements Thorn Global required. She begged Meredith to show some compassion, frantically negotiating for a truce, offering absolute submission in exchange for a financial bailout to save them from the devastating humiliation of public poverty. Meredith did not flinch. She did not attempt to pry Diane's desperate, sweating hands off her ankles. She stood perfectly still, an immovable pillar of absolute power, completely immune to the toxic theatrical display of manufactured grief unfolding at her feet. She looked down at the weeping matriarch and the trembling sister, her expression mirroring the absolute zero temperature of the boardroom she had just left. She saw right through the hysterical tears and the desperate promises. There was no genuine remorse. There was no actual love for Brandon. There was only the terrifying, paralyzing fear of losing their unearned luxury. Meredith looks down at them with icy detachment. You didn't care about family when you evicted me onto the street. You only care about the bank account attached to it. She steps over them and walks out the revolving doors. I stepped onto the sunlit plaza, the heavy glass revolving doors of Thorn Global sliding shut behind me, completely cutting off the pathetic echoing wails of my former mother-in-law and sister-in-law. The crisp afternoon air was a welcome relief from the suffocating toxic desperation infecting my lobby. The plaza itself was a chaotic sea of flashing camera bulbs and shouting financial journalists. A barricade of federal agents and my personal security team held back the surging crowd as a handcuffed, weeping Brandon was shoved into the back of an armored black SUV. The red and blue police lights washed over the pristine glass facade of my building. I did not spare my ex-husband a single glance. My focus was already shifting to the next operational directive. Before I could reach my waiting town car, a familiar figure stepped out from the periphery of the press barricade. Terrence moved with a calm, purposeful stride that starkly contrasted with the frantic circus surrounding us. He was dressed in a sharp, conservative navy suit, holding a thick, securely bound leather folio against his side. Unlike the sobbing women trapped inside the lobby or the shattered fraudster currently being read, his Miranda rights, Terrence did not possess an ounce of panic. His jaw was set tight, and his expression radiated an absolute, unwavering clarity. I signaled my security detail to let him pass the perimeter. He approached my vehicle, stopping just outside the open door. He did not ask for favors. He did not grovel for a fraction of the lifestyle his wife had just violently lost. Instead, he held out the leather folio, offering it to me with a steady, resolute hand. I took the heavy file, flipping open the cover to reveal hundreds of pages of meticulously highlighted bank transfers, routing numbers, and corporate registration certificates. Terrence spoke, his voice carrying clearly over the distant clamor of the reporters. He explained exactly what he had brought me. While tracking Brandon's digital footprint earlier that morning, Terrence had dug deeper into the secondary beneficiary accounts attached to the hedge fund. He had uncovered a sprawling, complex network of offshore trusts located in the Cayman Islands and the Seychelles. These accounts were not solely controlled by Brandon. The signature lines, the authorization forms, and the wire transfer receipts bore two very specific, undeniable names: Diane and Megan. Terrence detailed how his wife and mother-in-law were not merely ignorant beneficiaries of Brandon's massive Ponzi scheme. They had knowingly opened shell corporations under their maiden names. They had transferred stolen client yields into private holding accounts, actively laundering the capital to avoid regulatory detection. Brandon had used them to funnel millions out of the country away from the eyes of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they had willingly signed the paperwork to secure their own private slush funds. They were legally complicit, facing imminent federal indictment for conspiracy and money laundering. The luxury shopping bags they had dropped in my lobby were purchased with directly stolen assets. I looked up from the damning financial records, meeting Terrence's uncompromising gaze. He was handing me the final fatal nails for his own wife's coffin, fully aware of the catastrophic legal consequences she was about to face. I asked him why he was giving this to me, instead of quietly walking away from the wreckage. Terrence did not blink. He looked past me toward the glass facade of the building where the faint, blurry figures of Megan and Diane were still arguing with security guards. His expression hardened into pure granite. I married into a family of parasites. I am ending it today. He revealed the second phase of his strategy. He had not spent his morning simply auditing servers. He had been on the phone with his attorneys. The divorce papers had already been filed and expedited through the courts. More importantly, he had legally petitioned for immediate full and exclusive custody of his children. He calmly explained that he refused to allow his kids to spend another second being raised by toxic, manipulative narcissists who valued designer labels over basic human decency. With the hard evidence of Megan's federal crimes now securely in my hands and inevitably headed straight to the FBI, her chances of securing even partial custody were completely obliterated. She was going to federal prison, and Terrence was ensuring his children were permanently shielded from the fallout. I studied the man standing in front of me. For years, I had watched Terrence quietly endure the endless condescending jabs from Brandon and the arrogant dismissals from his own wife. He had been treated as a subordinate, a mere accessory to their manufactured prestige. Yet in the face of absolute systemic collapse, he was the only one who demonstrated exceptional competence, fierce loyalty, and a totally uncorrupted moral compass. He had exposed a $1 billion fraud, protected his children, and dismantled a criminal enterprise without asking for a single cent in return. I closed the leather folio and handed it to Arthur Sterling, who had just stepped out of the lobby to join me. I looked back at Terrence, my corporate instincts, recognizing an incredibly rare, highly valuable asset. The Thorn Global Executive Board required absolute ruthless integrity to manage our sprawling international portfolios. We needed someone who could spot financial rot from a mile away and surgically remove it without hesitation. I stepped closer to him, ignoring my waiting vehicle for another moment. I told him that his current employment situation was entirely unacceptable for a man of his caliber. I did not offer him a job. I issued a corporate directive. Thorn Global was expanding its internal oversight division, and I needed an apex predator guarding our gates. I extended my hand, officially offering him the position of Chief Compliance Officer at Thorn Global. The compensation package, the executive authority, and the stock options alone would instantly elevate his career far beyond anything Brandon had ever achieved, permanently cementing Terrence as a true corporate titan while his former family rotted behind bars. Terrence met my gaze, his expression devoid of hesitation. He extended his hand, and as our palms connected, the transaction was sealed. He was no longer a casualty of his wife's greed. He was the Chief Compliance Officer of Thorn Global, armed with a multi-million-dollar compensation package and the absolute authority to dismantle the very financial structures Brandon had used to exploit him. Megan's world was simultaneously disintegrating in the lobby far below. She had spent the last hour curled on the cold marble floor, weeping until her throat was raw, desperately waiting for a reprieve that would never come. Instead of salvation, a process server had casually approached her, dropping a thick manila envelope directly into her lap. It was a rapid-fire sequence of lethal blows. Divorce, full custody awarded to Terrence, immediate eviction from their primary residence. Her brother was currently in a federal holding cell. Her mother was hyperventilating in a nearby bathroom stall, and the man she had treated as a glorified spineless accessory had just legally and permanently excised her from his life. The paralyzing despair curdled into a blinding, psychotic rage. Megan stumbled out of the Thorn Global headquarters, completely ignoring the paparazzi, who flashed their aggressive cameras directly in her tear-streaked face. She practically crawled into the driver's seat of her pristine white Range Rover. Her hands shook violently as she gripped the leather steering wheel. Her mind snapped. She needed a target. She needed to physically destroy the architect of her misery. She floored the accelerator. The heavy luxury SUV roared through the city streets, recklessly blowing through red lights, her foot pinned to the floorboard. The scenic drive to the exclusive suburban enclave where my private estate was located passed in a blur of manic, dangerous adrenaline. Megan had convinced her fractured mind that if she could just get to me, if she could physically force me to reverse the corporate machinery, she could somehow salvage her ruined existence. The imposing wrought iron security gates of my property loomed at the end of a long, manicured private road. Megan did not hit the brakes. She gripped the wheel, let out a primal, deafening scream, and drove the 2-ton vehicle directly into the reinforced steel. The impact was catastrophic. Metal shrieked in protest, the airbags deployed with a violent explosive pop, and the front end of the Range Rover crumpled like discarded foil. The massive security gates buckled inward, groaning off their heavy concrete hinges, instantly triggering a symphony of high-decibel security alarms that echoed across the sprawling, pristine property. Megan kicked her door open, tumbling out onto the crushed driveway. Her expensive designer dress was torn at the seam, her face dusted with white chemical powder from the deployed airbag. She ignored the ringing in her ears and the blood dripping from her lip, pulling herself up to sprint toward the massive modern mansion. She screamed at the top of her lungs, a feral, unhinged screech that tore through her vocal cords. She demanded that I come outside. She cursed my name violently, blaming me for the divorce, for Brandon's arrest, and for the total annihilation of her perfectly curated reality. High above the manicured lawn, the French doors of my master suite balcony slid open. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, wearing a luxurious silk robe, my posture impeccably relaxed. I held a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee in my right hand. I did not yell back. I did not call down to the raving lunatic actively destroying my landscaping. I simply leaned against the cool glass railing, took a slow, deliberate sip from my mug, and watched the performance with absolute freezing detachment. Megan saw me standing there and lunged forward, clawing wildly at the air, shrieking that she would tear me apart with her bare hands. She made it exactly 5 steps before my private security detail materialized from the shadows of the property. 3 heavily armored guards tackled Megan to the cobblestone driveway with brutal efficiency. They drove her face first into the pavement, twisting her arms painfully behind her back. Megan thrashed like a trapped wild animal, spitting and cursing, her manicured nails scraping uselessly against the hard stone. I took another sip of coffee, thoroughly unimpressed by the gutter-level tantrum playing out on my driveway. The high-pitched wail of approaching sirens cut through Megan's frantic hysterics. 2 local police cruisers sped through the ruined gates, their red and blue lights reflecting off the shattered windshield of the smoking Range Rover. Officers poured out of the vehicles with their weapons drawn, shouting sharp, commanding orders. The private security team smoothly stepped back, handing over their prisoner to the authorities. The police hauled Megan to her feet, roughly securing her wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. They read her Miranda rights, citing felony trespassing, destruction of private property, and reckless endangerment. Megan continued to thrash, screaming that they did not know who she was, demanding they arrest me instead. She was shoved roughly against the side of the squad car, the cold metal biting into her cheek. She was weeping again, a pathetic, broken mess of a human being. As the arresting officer patted down her pockets, he pulled out her smartphone. The screen illuminated brightly in the darkening evening, vibrating with an incoming notification. Megan twisted her neck desperately, catching a glimpse of the text message preview from her white-collar defense attorney. It was not a message of hope or a promise of bail. The words burned into her retinas, sealing her fate completely. Federal mandate executed, all bank accounts fully frozen. Do not attempt to make any purchases. The screen went black, mirroring the sudden, absolute void of her future. Megan collapsed against the side of the police cruiser, her manicured knees finally giving out, as the arresting officer forced her into the back seat, slamming the heavy door shut on her life of stolen luxury. Far across the city, the true architect of their collective downfall was experiencing his own catastrophic reality check. Brandon huddled behind a rusted, overflowing dumpster in a rank, damp alleyway directly off Wall Street. The biting evening wind whipped through his torn, bespoke suit, chilling him to the bone. He peeked around the graffiti-covered brick corner, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and utterly manic. Directly across the avenue, his glittering corporate sanctuary was being systematically dissected. Dozens of federal agents swarmed the towering glass lobby, the crisp, authoritative yellow letters spelling FBI and SEC across their dark windbreakers stood out violently against the polished marble and chrome of his firm's entrance. Brandon watched, his breath hitching in rapid, shallow gasps, as heavily armed tactical units directed his former employees out onto the sidewalk. The senior analysts, the aggressive portfolio managers, the administrative assistants he had terrorized and commanded for years were now scattering into the cold street. They clutched small cardboard boxes of personal belongings, their faces etched with shock, public humiliation, and the sudden reality of unemployment. The physical dismantling of his empire was ruthlessly efficient. Agents rolled massive steel dollies out through the revolving doors stacked high with confiscated server racks, encrypted external hard drives, and heavy boxes of classified financial records. Decades of fabricated ledgers, illegal offshore routing numbers, and entirely falsified client portfolios were being loaded directly into a fleet of unmarked white vans. He watched a senior agent slap a heavy steel padlock and a thick chain across the main glass doors, snapping it shut with a definitive clack that echoed across the plaza. A bright orange federal seizure notice was taped directly onto the glass. The firm was dead. Brandon recoiled into the deep shadows of the alley, sliding down the grimy brick wall until he hit the wet, trash-littered pavement. He pulled his knees to his chest, violently shivering. The freezing concrete soaked right through his Italian wool trousers. He was completely devastatingly alone. Brittany had abandoned him without a second thought. His mother and sister were undoubtedly implicated in the offshore accounts. His executive team had likely already turned state's evidence to save themselves from lengthy prison sentences. He had no offshore parachute left to pull, no hidden vault of emergency cash, and absolutely nowhere to run. The paralyzing reality of a 20-year federal prison sentence crushed the remaining oxygen from his lungs. His hands trembled violently as he dug into his ruined jacket pocket, pulling out his personal cell phone. The battery icon glowed an angry red at 9%. He scrolled frantically past dozens of missed calls from panicked celebrity investors, furious shadow creditors, and blocked numbers. He tapped the single contact he had sworn to destroy just months prior. The phone rang once, twice. Meredith answered on the third ring. She did not say a single word. The line was open, radiating a terrifying, absolute silence. Brandon broke immediately. The arrogant, untouchable hedge fund titan evaporated entirely, leaving behind a sniveling, desperate shell of a man. He pressed the phone hard against his ear, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. He begged her. He wept openly, the hot tears mixing with the grime on his face. He pleaded with Meredith to call Arthur Sterling, to reach out to her father, to use the massive Thorn global legal team to intervene on his behalf. He promised he would sign the $1 buyout contract right now. He swore he would unconditionally surrender every single asset he had ever touched. He cried that he was sorry that his massive ego had blinded him, that he would spend the rest of his natural life making it up to her. He practically choked on his own saliva, promising to work for her for free, to be her loyal corporate slave, if she would just use her influence to make the federal warrants disappear. Meredith listened to the pathetic symphony of his destruction. She stood perfectly still on her private balcony, the cold evening air washing over her silk robe. She watched the flashing lights of the police cruiser carrying his sister disappear down the private road. She did not interrupt his weeping. She let him empty his lungs of every last ounce of desperate groveling, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his defeat. When he finally paused to gasp for air, her voice came through the receiver. It was smooth, lethal, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Did you really think Brittany's dad invested $5 million out of the goodness of his heart?" Brandon froze. The tears stopped tracking down his face. A new, much colder terror spiked in his chest as her words slowly penetrated his panicked brain. "I orchestrated that investment through a proxy, Brandon," Meredith stated, the clinical precision of her words echoing the absolute finality of a judge's gavel. Brandon's jaw went slack. He stared blindly at the brick wall opposite him. The sudden capital injection that had saved his firm, the money that had convinced him to marry Brittany, the very funds he had immediately routed into illegal offshore accounts to cover his previous losses, it was all a manufactured trap. "I gave you the rope," Meredith whispered, delivering the final fatal blow. "And you tied your own noose." A sharp click echoed through the speaker. Brandon pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the dark screen. He frantically tapped redial, his thumbs slipping on the glass surface. A mechanized, automated voice chimed loudly in the dark alleyway. "The number you are trying to reach has been blocked." The dead phone slipped from Brandon's trembling fingers, plummeting to the wet asphalt with a sharp crack that completely shattered the screen. He stared down at the fractured glass, his mind stalling as he tried to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of Meredith's final revelation. The $5 million lifeline had never been a rescue. It was a carefully deployed, highly weaponized anchor designed to drag him straight to the bottom of the ocean. He had blindly snatched the cash, funneled it through his illicit network to plug gaping holes in his ledger, and handed Meredith the exact financial paper trail she needed to secure his federal indictment. His entire empire was built on quicksand, and she had just triggered the sinkhole. Before his paralyzed brain could even send the signal to his legs to run, heavy boots splashed through the stagnant puddles at the mouth of the alley. Twin beams of blinding, high-wattage white light cut through the damp darkness, pinning Brandon against the filthy brick wall like a trapped animal. "Brandon Vance, keep your hands exactly where we can see them," a voice boomed, echoing violently off the narrow brick corridor. He threw his hands up to shield his eyes, whimpering, as 3 federal agents charged forward from the shadows. They did not treat him with the velvet-gloved deference he was accustomed to receiving in high-end boardrooms. The lead agent grabbed him roughly by the collar of his ruined, bespoke suit, spinning him around with enough force to slam his chest directly against the wet brick. The rough stone scraped his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood as his arms were wrenched forcefully behind his back. The cold, unforgiving steel of heavy handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting deep into his skin. "You have the right to remain silent." The agent recited his voice, a flat, mechanical drone that offered absolutely zero sympathy. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." They dragged him backward, pulling him out of the dark alley and thrusting him into the harsh, unforgiving glare of the main avenue. The moment Brandon emerged onto the sidewalk, a chaotic explosion of camera flashes erupted, blinding him instantly. Local news vans had swarmed the perimeter, their bright television lights illuminating his tear-streaked face, his disheveled hair, and the dark stain of alley water soaking the knees of his expensive trousers. Microphones were shoved aggressively into his face by shouting reporters demanding answers about the Ponzi scheme, the vanished millions, and the imminent arrests of his mother and sister. Brandon ducked his head, sobbing openly, completely humiliated on live international television, as agents shoved him into the back of a heavily armored federal transport vehicle. Miles away from the relentless media circus currently swallowing Wall Street, Brittany aggressively pushed her way through the dingy, reinforced glass door of a midtown pawn shop. Her oversized designer sunglasses barely masked her panicked, bloodshot eyes. She had spent the last 3 agonizing hours trying to use her black cards to book a flight out of the state, only to find every single account tied to Brandon completely frozen by federal mandate. Her luxury lifestyle had evaporated in a matter of seconds, leaving her stranded in the city, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the jewelry she had managed to grab before fleeing her apartment. She marched up to the scratched glass counter, wrinkling her nose at the stale smell of old cigarette smoke permeating the cramped shop. She reached into her handbag, pulling out the heavy velvet box Brandon had given her on their 6-month anniversary. She flipped the lid open, revealing the massive, glittering tennis necklace that he claimed was worth $250,000. "I need a cash advance immediately," Brittany demanded, her tone dripping with unearned, desperate arrogance. "I am willing to part with this for $50,000. It is completely flawless." The pawnbroker, a grizzled man with a heavy sigh, pulled a jeweler's loop from his stained shirt pocket. He did not seem remotely impressed by her attitude or her urgency. He picked up the heavy piece, angling it closely under a harsh fluorescent desk lamp. He studied the stones for less than 10 seconds before tossing the necklace unceremoniously back onto the counter. It landed with a dull, pathetic clatter. "Cubic zirconia," the pawnbroker grunted, turning his back to her to organize a shelf of cheap watches. "Set in rhodium-plated alloy. The clasp is already tarnishing. I will give you $40 for it as a novelty item, but honestly, it is basically costume jewelry." Brittany's mouth dropped open. The color rapidly drained from her perfectly contoured face. "You are lying!" she shrieked, slamming her hand against the thick glass counter. "That is a custom piece. Brandon paid $250,000 for that." The pawnbroker slowly turned around, pointing a thick, calloused finger toward the small television mounted in the upper corner of his shop. The local news channel was broadcasting live. The screen showed a weeping, handcuffed Brandon being shoved into a federal van, the bold red chyron beneath his face reading, "Hedge Fund CEO, arrested in massive multi-million-dollar fraud." "Looks to me like your boyfriend paid for a lot of things with imaginary money, lady," the pawnbroker said flatly. "Take your fake rocks and get out of my store." Brittany snatched the worthless necklace off the counter, stumbling backward out onto the gritty sidewalk. She stood frozen amid the rush of uncaring pedestrians, staring down at the cheap metal in her shaking hands. The grand illusion of her wealthy romance shattered into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. She had sold her youth, her reputation, and her dignity for a man who had draped her in worthless glass to stroke his own ego. She was entirely bankrupt, both morally and financially, left with absolutely nothing but the bitter taste of her own profound greed. High above the grit, the panic, and the complete destruction of her enemies, Meredith stood perfectly still in the penthouse suite of the Thorn Global skyscraper. The expansive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. The chaotic red and blue police lights surrounding Brandon's former office building were barely visible from this magnificent altitude, reduced to tiny, insignificant flashes in the distance. The suffocating toxicity that had plagued her life for years had finally been surgically and permanently removed. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse office swung open silently. William Thorne, her father, and the undisputed patriarch of the Thorne dynasty, stepped into the dimly lit room. He moved with the quiet, assured power of a man who had spent decades mastering the ruthless art of corporate warfare. He bypassed the massive mahogany desk, walking directly over to a sleek crystal decanter resting on a silver tray. He poured 2 measures of aged single malt whiskey into heavy crystal tumblers. He walked up beside Meredith, looking out at the sprawling metropolis they controlled. He extended his right hand, offering her one of the glasses. His expression was calm, devoid of any manufactured empathy or false pity for the parasites they had just eradicated from their ecosystem. "They took the bait perfectly," William said, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his weathered face. Meredith accepted the heavy tumbler. The amber liquid caught the reflection of the city lights, glowing like liquid gold. She looked at her father, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute vindication. She raised her glass, the heavy crystal catching the ambient light of the penthouse suite. Meredith clinked her glass against his. They always do. The sharp crystalline ring of the clinking whiskey glasses slowly faded, swallowed by the relentless forward march of time. 365 days later, that elegant sound had been entirely replaced by the harsh mechanical clang of heavy steel doors locking into place. Brandon Vance sat on a razor-thin mattress inside the Allenwood Federal Penitentiary. He wore a shapeless, faded khaki uniform that hung loosely over his noticeably diminished frame. The man who once terrorized Wall Street boardrooms now spent his days scrubbing industrial cafeteria floors for pennies an hour. He was currently serving year 1 of a mandated 10-year sentence. There were no offshore accounts waiting for his release. There were no sycophantic assistants fetching him espresso. He was just another inmate, an anonymous number stamped across a heavy canvas shirt, completely stripped of his arrogance, his wealth, and his manufactured prestige. Far away from the bleak concrete walls of federal prison, the fluorescent lights of a discount grocery store buzzed incessantly. Diane stood behind Register 4, wearing an ill-fitting polyester vest over a stained blouse. She mechanically scanned bruised apples and cheap canned goods, her feet throbbing inside sensible orthopedic shoes. She pasted a tight, resentful smile on her face as a customer aggressively demanded a coupon deduction. When her grueling 10-hour shift finally ended, Diane did not step into a waiting town car. She walked 3 blocks in the freezing rain to catch a city bus back to a cramped, mildew-scented studio apartment on the fringes of the city. She unlocked the flimsy door to find her daughter Megan sitting on a stained futon surrounded by mountains of cheap, heavily highlighted legal printouts. Megan looked entirely unrecognizable. Her designer wardrobe had been sold off piece by piece just to cover basic utility bills. Dark, heavy bags shadowed her eyes. She was aggressively clutching a custody petition, desperately fighting a legal battle she had absolutely no chance of winning. Terrence had secured full exclusive custody of their children months ago. The judges had taken one look at her money laundering indictments and summarily dismissed every single appeal she filed. Megan was trapped in that suffocating room with her mother, two bitter, toxic women with absolutely nothing left to do but blame each other for their spectacular self-inflicted downfall. Across town, Brittany was experiencing her own brand of total annihilation. She stood outside the velvet ropes of an exclusive Manhattan nightclub, the bitter wind whipping through her thin, off-brand jacket. She watched as women she used to call her closest friends glided past the bouncers, completely ignoring her desperate waves. She was a total pariah. After the pawn shop incident, her bank accounts had been foreclosed by creditors. Her luxury apartment had been seized. The elite society she had sacrificed her dignity to infiltrate had instantly and brutally ostracized her, treating her like a highly contagious disease. She had gambled her youth on a fraud, and her prize was absolute crushing bankruptcy. The miserable existence of the parasites was a stark poetic contrast to the blinding triumphant light radiating from the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Thorn Global was hosting its annual charity gala, an event that had become the crown jewel of the New York social season. The room was a breathtaking sea of crystal chandeliers, cascading white orchids, and the most powerful financial titans in the country. Meredith Thorne moved through the glittering crowd with absolute unchallenged authority. She was no longer just the daughter of the founder. She was the officially appointed Chief Executive Officer of Thorn Global. She wore a stunning emerald green velvet gown that draped perfectly across her frame, projecting an aura of lethal grace and uncompromising power. Investors parted like the Red Sea to let her pass, eager to catch her eye, desperate for a fraction of her attention. Standing proudly near the front row of the main stage was Terrence. He looked remarkably sharp in a custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a glass of sparkling water. The stress and subjugation he had endured during his marriage to Megan had been entirely erased from his features. As Thorn Global's most trusted executive and chief compliance officer, he had surgically restructured the firm's oversight protocols, saving the company billions and cementing his status as a legendary corporate powerhouse. More importantly, he went home every single night to his children, raising them in a stable, loving environment, completely free from narcissistic manipulation. When Meredith caught his eye, Terrence raised his glass in a silent, deeply respectful salute. The low murmur of the ballroom hushed instantly as Meredith ascended the marble steps to the main podium. The spotlight hit her, illuminating the absolute clarity and strength in her gaze. She looked out over the sea of powerful executives, her posture straight, her voice ringing out through the state-of-the-art sound system. She delivered a masterful, commanding speech about the architecture of resilience. She spoke about the necessity of tearing down corrupted foundations to build something stronger. She spoke directly to the women in the room, challenging them to unconditionally own their worth, to refuse to shrink themselves to accommodate fragile egos, and to recognize their inherent power in a world designed to underestimate them. Her words captivated the entire ballroom. She spoke of the future of legacy and of unrelenting integrity. Through the entirety of her 20-minute address, she did not mention Brandon Vance once. She did not reference the scandal, the divorce, or the betrayal. He was not a cautionary tale. He was not a footnote. He was entirely, emphatically erased from her history, reduced to absolute nothingness. Thunderous applause erupted as she concluded her speech, echoing off the high gilded ceilings of the ballroom. Meredith stepped down from the podium, leaving the celebration behind as she walked out onto the grand private terrace. The crisp night air enveloped her. She leaned her hands against the cool stone balustrade, looking out over the glittering, endless skyline of New York City. The towering skyscrapers sparked like diamonds against the dark sky, a vast empire of light and ambition. Meredith took a deep, steadying breath. She had been tested by betrayal, targeted by greed, and pushed to the absolute brink. Yet she had refused to be broken. She had taken the weapons used against her and mastered the game better than anyone else ever could. She looked out over the city that was now undeniably hers, a woman who had systematically dismantled her enemies and won everything simply by remaining true to her own unyielding strength. The story of Meredith's triumph teaches a vital lesson. True power is built on unyielding integrity and self-reliance, not manipulation. Brandon and Megan constructed their lives on toxic entitlement, believing they could exploit others without consequence. In contrast, Meredith and Terrence refused to remain victims. They used strategic patience and hard-earned competence to completely dismantle the false empires built by their abusers. Ultimately, the greatest revenge isn't merely watching toxic people face the fallout of their own destructive actions. It is stepping into your own unshakable strength. Take back your power today by setting firm boundaries and share your experiences in the comments below.